I think we'll get started. So good evening, everybody, and happy St. Bridget's Day as well, first day of spring at last. You're all very welcome to this Mondays at the Mess talk. And for those of you who are new, Mondays at the Mess is a talk series run by Richmond Barracks in Inchicore by Dublin City Council Culture Company, which run cultural projects and buildings across the city. And we've, like many people, had to revert to using Zoom in the past few months for these talks, but usually they would happen in real life in the gymnasium hall in Richmond Barracks. So you're all very welcome. And in a minute, I'm going to hand over to our speaker for this evening. But before I do, I just want to let you know that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk. And if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. You can take a look now and you can type your question in there if you have any, and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end. And you might also like to know that this talk is being recorded. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, or if you had a friend who couldn't get a ticket, we will be sharing it on our channels at a later date. So our speaker this evening is Dr. Mary McAuliffe, who is an assistant professor in gender studies at UCD and holds a PhD from the School of History and Humanities, Trinity College Dublin. Her publications include We Were There, 77 Women of the Easter Rising, which was co-written by Liz Gillis, and she recently published a biography of Margaret Skinnider, which was published by the UCD Press. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mary McAuliffe for our talk this evening.
Thank you, Kate, and hello everyone, and delighted to have you all here. It's I suppose a mark of the interest in this these histories, these more hidden histories, that there are so many people signed in to come along and hear about these stories tonight. And really what the title says is what I'm doing this evening, having no use at all for men, same-sex relationships among Irish women revolutionaries and female activists. And it's part of research I'm doing on a cohort of women, all of whom chose to have relationships with other women throughout this period. And I really question whether it was because of that radical political space they were in that they could do that, or it's because they were political women and we have archives for them that we know of their relationships, and maybe they would have had these relationships anyway, unbeknownst to history. And in her diary, writer, suffrage and Republican activist Rosamund Jacob noted that neither of her friends, a fellow suffrage and Republican activists Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine Mullen, both of whom had fought as members of the Irish Citizen Army in 1916 and who lived together in Rathmines for many years, had any use at all for men. And that's where that quote comes from that I use in the title. Jacob goes on to describe a domestic scene of the two women who, when she called to see them in Rathmines, were breakfasting, as she said, in bed, as was their custom. This relationship, which Roy Foster in Vivid Faces says had all the marks of a marriage, lasted 30 years, from when the women met during the 1913 lockout to Madeleine's death in 1944, and Kathleen Lynn lives for 10 years after that. During all that time, the couple lived together, shared a life together, were activists together, and in their diaries leave hints of an intimate partnership. Lynn and French Mullen are relatively well-known historical figures and are included in most revolutionary, gendered and medical histories of the early to mid-20th century. Of course, they were co-founders of St. Ultan's Hospital for Sick Infants and did a lot of work with their staff, including Dr. Dorothy Stopford Price, say, for example, on eradicating TB, on child poverty, on child illnesses. So they are in many histories. Yet their partnership is most often written of in terms of their political and social activism, not their obvious, intimate, personal relationship. Despite 40 years of dedicated, rigorous scholarship and revolutionary and first-wave feminist women, here are still histories that are silent, histories that are invisible. And it is these queer histories, in particular queer female histories, that I wish to talk to you about this evening. So from the 1980s, the historiography of women in the rising and the following years of violence through to 1923, and then what happened to these women in the Irish Free State and Irish Republic is one of constant recovery, rewriting and reiteration. Over 40 years of research and writing of the women of this period, mainly, it must be said, by women historians and researchers has led to a real richness of scholarship. However, even within this gendered and feminist scholarship, the exclusion, sometimes deliberate, because some historians were uncomfortable writing about the very obvious personal relationships people like Lynn and French Mullen were having, but not just them. The histories of these women who chose to spend their lives with women is evident. As noted by Judith Bennett in her book History Matters, Western culture's long-standing willingness to disbelieve in female same-sex love is alive and well in women's history, as well as in mainstream history, and within which lesbianism remains a tricky subject and sometimes an unspeakable one. Further writings on lesbian histories, on cultures and language and definitions come from Adrienne Rich, Martha Vincinis, Joan Scott, Joan Nessels, among others who've helped define, complicate and elaborate on the difficulties of historicizing the lesbian, or indeed defining the lesbian. As Martha Vincinis commented in 1994, the lesbian is a popular subject for scrutiny. She exists, but how are we to define her history? How do we include her? And where do we begin? Further studies increasingly decentralize sexual activity from the study of the lesbian, much influenced by Adrienne Rich's pivotal 1980 essay in Signs, the feminist journal, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. In this, she explained that by using the term lesbian continuum, she intended to include a range through each woman's life and throughout history of women-defined experiences, not simply the fact that a woman has had or consciously explored genital sexual experiences with other women. Much research then concentrated on the concept of the romantic friendship, of homosocial groups or female couples in what were called in America, for example, and we've adopted this term on this side of the Atlantic, Boston marriages, where whether they did it or not was not considered, where sex was not considered. Couples in Ireland who fitted this type of historicizing included the 18th century couple, the ladies of Llangollen, two cousins who eloped together and lived their lives in Wales. And in the 19th century, couples like the writers Somerville and Ross. As Carol Smith Rosenberg remarked in her study of the female world of love and ritual in the 19th century in America, at one end of the continuum lies committed heterosexuality, and at the other end, uncompromising homosexuality. Between a wide latitude of emotions and sexual feelings, we can sometimes find these women. However, the studies of these presumed asexual, homosocial female friendships does obscure the existence of women who desired and had intimate relations with women. Historian Helena Whitbread's Untangling of the Code, in which Anne Lister wrote her diaries, have given us the life and world of an early 19th century Northern English aristocratic woman who devoted her life to the pursuit of love and sex with other women. These diaries reveal, as Jack Halberstam writes, a world that is structured less by romantic friendships and a shared refusal of patriarchy, and more by unequal desire, sexual and gender roles, ritualized class relations, and an almost total rejection of sexual sameness. Anne Clark's discussion of the Lister diaries also returned to the concept of the sexual-centered lesbian histories, where women like Lister, to quote Clark, invented her own fragmented lesbian identity and confused the categories of masculinity and femininity. And so what I'm really saying here is that the revolutionary period gives us a lot about sexuality and romantic love among the heterosexual young men and women who got involved in the politics of the time, and Foster's Vivid Faces really explores that milieu in which a lot of these young people were operating, you know, falling in love themselves without permission of their parents, making romantic matches rather than made matches. And this was quite radical at the time. But what is even more radical are these women who are choosing to go outside even that radical breaking with tradition. But the fact that these lesbians were women also serves to make invisible these histories. While we know many of the radical women having a heterosexual, unorthodox heterosexual relationship, we don't know about the women because even for these more radical women, their public lives are not easily researched or written. More recently, there's been an opening up of the studies on women's sexual agencies outside of the norm of marital, reproductive, and domestic. Leanne Lane's biography of Rosamund Jacob, for example, who I quoted in the beginning, shows a woman who, although she never marries, never stopped longing to find love, companionship, and marriage, and also writes in her diaries about the sexual relationship she had, very frankly, in her diaries, she had with Frank Ryan. Sources like this show us that there are spaces, invisible, secret spaces, dangerous spaces, in which women could have sexual relationships outside the marital and the procreative and the heteronormative as well. And it is in these spaces, often opened by radicalism and by revolutionary politics, that I have looked for the women I wish to talk about in the paper this evening. Tracing the activists and feminist kinship networks of the suffrage and nationalist women of the early 20th century in Ireland is rightly framed as an integral part of the political and revolutionary histories of the period. Writing women into these spaces can be fraught, however, with difficulty. The task for the feminist historian is, as Joan Scott writes, to deconstruct the way in which gender acts as a system of meaning-making and knowledge, how it operates historically to reinforce or challenge dominant social formations of femininity and masculinity. In writing of a world of men and women, while we do gain some knowledge of women, it's most often in relation to men and to men's worlds of culture and politics. And indeed, when we see Roy Foster writing about this early 20th century world of student societies, of theatre groups, of feminist collectives, volunteer militias, Irish language groups, who he said were linked by youth radicalism, subversive activism, enthusiasm and work. It is the world of men that is forefronted, and where women exist in this world, it's because they were related to or associated with the men or invited into that world by the men. Not always, but for the most part. And while the world Foster evokes is one dominated by youthful, romantic, heterosexual passions, although he does mention a number of the women who had same-sex relationships, there is no doubt, as with the British first wave feminist history of saphists and suffragettes, that there was space here for women who made their lives political and personal with other women. Group experience is often a powerful way to understand the lives of women who operated within the hierarchies of a patriarchal culture, coexisting and challenging those hierarchies. In the early 20th century, women of the new generation, many of whom came to feminism, socialism, and militant nationalism, the three great causes in Ireland that Markovich talks about, not only chose radical politics, they also chose radical lives. And we know about the women who chose the radical heterosexual lives, Markovich being case in point, going to Paris to study art, having a very bohemian lifestyle with her husband, Count Markovich, and then sending their only child off to Lissadell to be raised by her mother as she committed herself to politics. Maud Gonne is another case in point. However, it's the group of urban-dwelling radical activists, rebels, feminists, among whom were a cohort who also chose to make their lives with each other, whom I wish to introduce you to this evening. In particular, I want to look at 4 couples. I have in my research at the moment about 10 couples. However, there isn't enough time to talk about all of them, so I'll talk about the 4 ones I'll talk this evening. If I have a little more time, I'll introduce you to the others. One of the main issues about writing lesbian histories is how do we find the women involved in same-sex relationships? They don't use the term lesbian. They don't talk about it openly. They often don't leave any huge evidence, even in their own private letters and archives. And archival and interview materials are also subjective and only allow us initially to explore the centrality of economic independence, higher education, and the capacity to be involved in revolutionary movements of many of the middle class. And this is very much a class study as well. I am very conscious that there are only 2 working class couples within this study. Again, that's to do with the absence of proof rather than the absence of absence. We can see now that the space for lesbian relationships to flourish in revolutionary movements all enabled new ways of living, desiring, and being with other women. It's not easy, but the evidence for some couples is there in the archive if it's searched with a feminist, a gendered, and a queer lens. So the first couple I want to talk about are Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Grenon. Often considered lifelong friends, and this is what they're talked about. They actually knew each other, and in the 1911 census taken in Elizabeth O'Farrell's family home, Julia is actually recorded as a visitor on that night. They went to the same school together, and from early 1900s, when they join Union na hÉireann, they're activists together. They lived together almost all of their lives in Mount Street, and they are buried together in Glasnevin. So you could say they were lifelong comrades and very best friends. What then do I see as proof that they were more than friends? And here, you know, we can't talk about physical intimacy or physical relationships. What I'm talking about is a relationship that has all the markers, as Roy Foster said of Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine Mullen, of a marriage. One of the first pieces of evidence we get, other than the fact that they're living together and they're active together, is when Elizabeth O'Farrell goes out famously to take the surrender flag to the British as the rebels are in Moore Street. And Elizabeth O'Farrell is described as a very pretty and very pale woman as she left the last GHQ to deliver the surrender to the British, leaving Julia behind with the garrison. The wounded James Connolly tried to soothe the anxious Julia, reassuring her that Elizabeth would be fine. So again, you see Connolly immediately reassuring Julia that Elizabeth would be fine, that there is a recognition here of a relationship between the two women that is different than just being comrades in arms. They lived then their life together, and they are activists together. They both are anti-treaty. They reject the legitimacy of the Irish Free State. They commit their lives to a militant republicanism for the rest of their lives. And as I said, they live in 27 Lower Mount Street. And I suppose the evidence I find most compelling is at the end of their lives. When you see the death notice of Elizabeth O'Farrell, who dies in 1957, and it says the chief mourners were Miss Sheila Grenon, and then Elizabeth's family. Another notice said the relatives and lifelong partner of the late nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell. And Julia is in the position where a widower would be, or a widower is a man who died. She has been given that position of privilege. And when I went to see the papers of Elizabeth and Julia that are in the National Library of Ireland, there are dozens and dozens of memorial cards, sympathy letters, all being sent to Julia on the loss of her lifelong partner. And that language, or lifelong comrade, or your friend, that language of comrade, friend, and partner is used interchangeably throughout this. Then, however, there is another incident that makes me question the depth of their relationship and how deep it actually was. Elizabeth is buried in Glasnevin in a grave that is at a distance from the Republican plot where Markovitch and many of the others of her comrades are buried. Some years after Elizabeth has been buried, Julia buys a grave beside the Republican plot, has Elizabeth disinterred and reinterred in this plot in 1959, and then unveils the gravestone that is there to this day with the quotation from the poem of Brian O'Higgins. And you can see here then she left a space for her faithful comrade and lifelong friend, Sheila Grenon. Another incident then is another piece of evidence is when Julia is interviewed by Ita Mallon in the Evening Herald in 1972, when Julia is 83, living alone in a flat in Lower Mount Street where she and her Lizzie, and this is what Ita writes, had shared for over half a century. And she goes on to talk about how Julia talked about Elizabeth, even got emotional, even at that stage. Elizabeth had been dead for almost 20 years. The flat, she said, had become for Julia both a home and a shrine, not a marble palace for mourning, though mentions of Nurse O'Farrell brought the ready tears, but a place where they could relive the memory of all that they had done together, the good times and the bad, the tours in Ireland, the holidays in Rome, and of course, the rising. And so this is the lifelong relationship between Julia Grenon and Elizabeth O'Farrell that has, again, to quote Foster, all the markers of a marriage. Here is Elizabeth O'Farrell's basically still remaining true to her, still mourning her, still talking about her, still thinking about her. She had already secured her grave in Glasnevin, that they would be buried together beside the Republican plot and beside their comrades, but both of them together for eternity. And as you can see, they're buried there beside the Republican plot. The second couple I want to talk about are Madeleine French-Mullen and Kathleen Lynn. And they are a couple. There's no doubt that there is an acceptance now that both of them are a couple. As I said, Rosamund Jacob records in her diary that neither Madeleine or Kathleen had any use for men at all. Luckily, both of them leave diaries, and it isn't often that you get material that gives us an insight into the private lives of these women. Madeleine's diary is more political, it's more about what they did in 1916. Kathleen Lynn kept a diary every day of her life from 1916 onwards, for the most part. And indeed, hopefully that select extracts from that will be published, edited by myself and the archivist in the Harriet Wheelock, the archivist in the Royal College of Physicians, within the next year or so. But if we read Kathleen Lynn's diary, we can see evidence of an intimate relationship between them. These are the words of Madeleine French-Mullen, which come from the Allen archive. It is after the women have been moved to Kilmainham jail. They had been in, Kathleen had been in the City Hall garrison, and Madeleine had been in the Royal College of Surgeons. Madeleine did not know where Kathleen was once they had been moved to Kilmainham jail after the surrender. And she says on May the 1st, "What a night of news." The warden told her how she and some dozens of others were this was one of the other women, had told her that some dozens of others were all weak in Ship Street Barracks, including Dr. Lynn, who had been moved with them to Kilmainham that evening. Asked if the matron, if we might exchange Bessie for Dr. Lynn, and Bessie is one of the working class citizen army women. And again, you see that there is really class politics going on here as well. And she says yes in the morning. Bessie, being one of the Countess's camp followers, was quite content to be exchanged. Thought the morning would never come. We had various stories that the doctor was arrested, missing, and the Countess and I feared we would not see her again. And then on the second day, she said, met the doctor going for water, had her to breakfast, hip, hip. Later on, Kathleen Lynn is moved to Mountjoy Jail and Madeleine is released. And Kathleen writes in her diary that she would give anything, even coming back to Mountjoy Jail, even though to Kilmainham Jail, even though Mountjoy is better and better living conditions for the women, just so she could be with Madeleine. In Kathleen Lynn's diary, we get recurring evidence of their intimate life together. They lived together in Rathmines. They were lovers of the outdoors and had a cottage up in Glenmalure in County Wicklow, which is now an Onoiga hostel. And in Dr. Lynn's diary, she described their holidays up there, talking about one morning getting up very late, bathing in the river and getting back into bed to warm up. And there was only one bedroom there with one bed. And so we know they were getting into bed together. We also know they were slept in the same bedroom in Rathmines, in the house that they share all of their lives. Some historians have said that because Kathleen Lynn loved the outdoors so much, she slept on an outdoors balcony and Madeleine slept in the bed. We have no proof of that. The outdoor balcony was open to the elements. I would presume she didn't sleep out there, certainly not outside of maybe summertime. But the fact is that these women shared a bedroom, shared a house, and shared a life together, and are very much a couple. Accepted by their compatriots as a couple. They're always together. They're never seen without one another. And indeed, in the documentary done by Kathleen Lynn, one of the interviewees, who I was a nurse with them, said you never saw one of them in a room in the hospital in St. Ultan's without the other being not far behind her. And again, so the evidence points to this, again, being a long-term same-sex relationship between two women who were activists, who were socialists, and who were feminists. The third one I want to talk about, of course, is Margaret Skinnider, a woman who I've just recently published a biography of. When I started working on Margaret Skinnider, I had a suspicion that it is possible she would have had relationships with women. There was no indication that she had any intimate relationships with men, and she certainly wasn't married. And the interesting thing about a lot of these women is when you look at their histories, if you get brief biographies of them, say on the Dictionary of Irish Biography or the Cambridge or other biographies, if they haven't married, at the end you just get, say, and she never married. There's no exploration of whether this was because they were involved in other relationships, including same-sex relationships. And with Margaret Skinnider, in the course of research, I discovered who her life partner was. Her lifelong best friend was Nora Connolly O'Brien. Her life partner was fellow activist and Cumann member Nora O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe was from Tipperary. I figured out through the course of the research that they most likely met in 1919 when Margaret was on the Republican Women's Tour, in 1918 in America after the Rising. Margaret, of course, had famously not been arrested in the Rising because she had been wounded. However, Margaret was always skirting with the edges of femininity and masculinity. And through the course of research, I discovered the original of the famous picture of her wearing boys' clothes when she's passing off as a member of the Fianna. She was very proud of her ability to pass as a member of the Fianna. But however, the original, and it's interesting that the photo of Margaret on her own is used in her Doing My Bit memoir and published in that, which was published in 1917. But the original is much more queer in its aspect, with Margaret with two young women linking arms with her. And this was probably taken when she was passing as a Fianna member up the Wicklow Mountains when she was here in Dublin in 1915. It does seem rather wintry. Margaret herself was very conscious of female and male roles. During the Rising, we can see in her reporting and Doing My Bit for Ireland, she always wore her dresses when she went as a messenger, when she was carrying messages between the Royal College of Surgeons and the GPO. But when she took her gun and went up onto the roof of the Royal College of Surgeons, she changed into the uniform of the Irish Citizen Army that Countess Markievicz had made for her, because she said it was only dressed as a soldier of the Irish Citizen Army, and that would be in male attire, that she could really participate as a militant in that way. So she was very conscious of playing those roles of male and female. She was also, as I said, very much engaged in a same-sex relationship from 1919 onwards. We have evidence that both Margaret and Nora returned to Dublin in 1919. They're living together in Fairview then, and they lived together until Nora's death in the 1950s in Clontarf, in Seafield Avenue in Clontarf. I met with Margaret's grandniece, and found that she had a fantastic collection of photographs that were taken of Margaret and Nora over the years. And here you can see on the left-hand side, the woman in the white dress and the woman in the middle. That woman in the middle is Margaret, and the woman in the white dress is Nora. And so you have probably the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s iterations of Margaret and Nora living their lives in Seafield Avenue. One other piece of evidence that makes me realize that Margaret and Nora had proof were involved in a relationship. Margaret apparently kept diaries all of her life. And on her death, her nephew burned her diaries as he did not, her executor. He did not want her private life to make it into the history books. Their relationship, however, is now in the history books. I also met with the O'Keeffe family, and they talked about the two women living in Seafield Avenue and the visits that the O'Keeffes made to that house. So the women visited each other, they were integrated into each other's families, and they lived together all of their lives in that house in Clontarf. They were also activists together. And interestingly, if you look at the newspapers when Cumann women they knew would have died, and the reporting of who was at the funeral, and it would always be Miss Margaret Skinnider and Miss Nora O'Keeffe. So they're going to these occasions together, they get invited to meetings of old Cumann together, and they live their life together. And the photographic archive that Margaret's grandniece has shows their holidays together, their public life together, their life at home together. They also raised and bred wolfhounds. So they had a very interesting and expansive life. A woman I came across that I'd had no idea about being involved in a same-sex relationship, of course, was Kathleen O'Brennan. Now, Kathleen O'Brennan is a very interesting person, an Irish campaigner for independence, a journalist and a playwright. She's sister of Anya Kant, originally Anya O'Brennan, who was the widow of Eamon Kant, a signatory to the proclamation, and her younger sister was Lily O'Brennan, also a writer and playwright. In 1918 and 19, Kathleen undertook a lecture tour in the US, like with the Republican Women's Tour, speaking on behalf of Sinn Féin about the place of women in the Irish Republic and about Gaelic culture and the Gaelic League. Returning to Ireland, she got involved in the Abbey Theatre and wrote many plays over the years, which were produced by the Abbey. While she was in America, she gets very much involved with the industrial women workers of the world, very much the radical trade union activists. And this brought her to the attentions of the US authorities. She had become involved with the industrial workers of the world, or the Wobblies, as they were known, through Dr. Marie Equi, the woman on your right as you're looking at the screen. Marie Equi, I don't have time to go into her, but she is a fascinating woman. She is the daughter of a mother from County Tyrone and an Italian father. Kathleen and Marie Equi get involved in a romantic relationship. Marie has been an out lesbian, more or less, for many, many years at this stage, and she herself has had several long-term relationships with women. And indeed, there's no evidence that she was ever involved with men at all. When Equi was arrested for her role as a radical socialist, O'Brennan worked to see her released and continued to agitate until her own arrest in 1919. The US government issued a deportation order for O'Brennan, but it was not enforced. And there is a report from the FBI on Kathleen O'Brennan and her relationship with Marie Equi, so we can see even then they knew they were involved in what was called a deviant relationship. She continues to work in America and finally comes back in the mid-1920s to Ireland, where she works and writes until her death, and very much is associated with the militant women's activism in the Irish Republic. Equi knows all of the Irish Republican women who are going to America, and there is real evidence that there is a cohort of women who are well connected. Equi also writes to Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and seems to have a bit of a crush on Hannah. Indeed, in reading her letters, she's very flirtatious with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and these letters still exist in the Hannah Sheehy Skeffington archive. Equi also knew Gertrude Kelly, who was an Irish woman born in Waterford, taken by her family, her parents, to America when she was about 9 or 10, is a founder of the Cumann na mBan in New York, and lives her life with another Irish woman, Mary Walsh. All of these women know each other. When the Republican women go on tour, Kathleen Lynn, Mary McSweeney, Muriel McSweeney, they all visit with Marie Equi because she is introducing them to people who are in the know. Equi herself is interesting as well, and I suppose we can see her as part of this Irish lesbian history because of her Irish connections. She is half Irish. She battled discrimination and harassment. She was convicted in 1918 under the Sedition Act for preaching against US involvement in World War I, and she was sentenced to a 3-year term in San Quentin State Prison. She is the only known lesbian and radical to be incarcerated at the prison. She also had a decade-long relationship with well-known feminist and socialist and woman of Irish descent, Elizabeth Gurley Friend, who was first-generation Irish-American. And as I said, she knew all of the Irish women activists. In her letters to Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, she asks about Kathleen O'Brennan. Obviously, it would seem from those letters that the women, despite their romantic involvement, were no longer communicating by the late 1920s. Another person I want to talk about, of course, is the famous Helena Maloney. Helena is, many of you would know of her as the revolutionary, the trade union activist, the socialist and Abbey actress who got involved first through hearing Maud Gonne speak in early 1900 and joins Innian na hÉireann, one of the few political organisations to facilitate engagement by women who were denied the vote and excluded from most political and cultural organisations. Maloney soon becomes very much well-respected orator and activist. And she's secretary for Minini, and from 1908 she establishes Ban na HÉireann, their newspaper, and is a writer in it. Ban na HÉireann, of course, advocates militancy, separatism and feminism. She is very close to Labour and to James Connolly, and like many of the radical women, she takes a left-wing trajectory and is involved in the 1913 lockout. Around this time, interestingly enough, she got to know Kathleen Lynn and brought her into the socialist and militant organisations. And it is through Helena Maloney that Kathleen Lynn ends up at the soup kitchen during the lockout in Liberty Hall in 1913, where she meets Madeleine French Mullen. Lynn or Maloney also brings Markievicz into radical politics. Maloney fights in 1916 as member of the Citizen Army. She's taken to Richmond Barracks and then on to Kilmainham, and she's one of the few women who's actually interned in England. She's considered so dangerous. It is often thought that she had romantic entanglements with either or both Sean Connolly, who was shot dead in City Hall during 1916, and Bulmer Hobson, who was the founder of the Na Fianna, the Irish Boy Scouts. Maloney, of course, had been on the Abbey stage with Sean Connolly and would have known him well, and she would have known Bulmer Hobson as well. However, neither of these relationships last. Obviously, Connolly dies in 1916, and indeed she's not has any association romantically with Hobson after that. We do know, however, by the late 30s, she's getting involved with Evelyn O'Brien. Maloney has a very hard life. She doesn't have a secure accommodation. Kathleen Lynn often talks about her sleeping on the couch. She, in our modern parlance, couch surfaces a lot with her friends. She's an alcoholic, has real problems with that. And like many of them, the trauma of her activist work and probably the work during the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence impacted emotionally and psychologically on her because of her mental health difficulties. Her Abbey stage career peters out, and she ends up in Grangegorman, where she is being treated by Dr. Evelyn O'Brien. And it is with Evelyn O'Brien that she forms a relationship and spends the last 20 years of her life living actually just up the road from where I live in a house on the North Circular Road. Firstly, a house that would have been given to a psychiatrist working in Grangegorman, and then in Sutton with Evelyn O'Brien. And as her biographer, Helena's biographer says, her later years with Evelyn O'Brien gave her great peace and solace as she began to be feted as one of the great survivors of the Rising, albeit with large parts of her legacy suppressed. She died in 1967. And I looked at the obituary for Helena Maloney in 1967, and unlike Julia Grenon and Elizabeth O'Farrell, Evelyn O'Brien is mentioned, but simply as one of the attendees at the suppression. There is some evidence that O'Brien's family were not best pleased with the relationship with Maloney. Of course, she was 20 years or more older than Evelyn O'Brien, and they perhaps did not see that as something that was good for Dr. O'Brien. But we know from the evidence that their relationship was happy and peaceful and brought solace to Helena Maloney. There are many others I want to talk about before I move on. One couple that I haven't had time to discuss, but Margot Trench and Judy Withers are interesting in that there are love letters between them in the National Library of Ireland in the Trench papers. Margot Trench was the sister of Seska Trench. Seska Trench kept diaries until she died in the Spanish flu in 1918. Both of them were involved in cultural nationalism, in militant nationalism, and in feminism, in suffrage feminism. Judy Withers, whom I've yet to firmly place within her history, was an English suffragette. Margot and Judy were involved and write the most beautiful love letters from Judy exist to Margot in the National Library of Ireland. And these are the pieces of evidence that one finds. Of course, the most famous couple from this period are not living in Ireland, but of course, they have huge Irish connections. And Sonia Tiernan's great work on mining down into their relationship overturned what their first biographer did, Gifford Lewis, who had said to Sir Jocelyn Gore Booth, "You will be pleased to know that I could not find a trace of perverted sexuality." They, Eva and Esther, actually had a campaign, complete with journal, to persuade people to abandon sexuality altogether. And this was the journal they edited together, Urania, which of course was not about abandoning sexuality, but about nonconformity to heteronormative sexuality. And we know that Esther and Eva were an intimate couple and lived together all their lives, are now buried in London together in the same grave under a quotation from Sappho. And anyone interested in their relationship should read Sonia Tiernan's biography of Eva Gore Booth. I mentioned Gertrude Kelly and her partner Margaret Mary Walsh. Ella Young, literary revivalist, Irish Republican, teacher and poet, friend of Maud Gonne, was definitely one of the women who had lesbian leanings and some lesbian relationships throughout her long life. There's also hints that Louis Bennett, head of the Irish Women's Workers' Union, and her partner, Helena Shivana, were lifelong female partners. And these are just some of the women. I have some evidence of some others I am investigating and as yet haven't fully found the proof, but I feel that more mining into the archives may give me some more details. These private lives, integral as they are to the motivation of their public actions, deserve study, and the continuing exclusion from our history has to be corrected. Social and public history needs to include the study of marginalised groups, and the twice marginal, twice invisible status of lesbian women in Ireland deserves serious redressing. In 2016, we had all the national commemorations of the Rising. We had the army deliver the tricolour to every school in the country. We had spectacular marches down O'Connell Street. We had gardens, roads, roundabouts named after the signatories of the proclamation after women in Cumann. We even in 2013 had a bridge over the Liffey named after a young working class trade union activist and rebel, Rosie Hackett. Along with this, we had the people of Ireland re-looking at the documents central to this revolutionary period, the Proclamation of 1916, and realising that with its full promise of full and complete equality for women, it was a radical document for a radical generation. But there are still histories that are silent, histories that are invisible. And these silent histories cannot continue to be written out, as they are often not thought of, not looked at, not included in the first place. So were there lesbians prominent in the overlapping feminist, socialist, trade union and Republican circles whose sexuality has remained hidden from history? I think this conversation this evening has shown that there are women who lived in the same house, slept in the same bed for 30 years, who had their lesbianism strongly denied by women. And it's interesting that this happens because men and women who take walks together are included to be involved in some heterosexual relationship. So the burden of proof on showing same-sex relationships can be high, in fact, too high, and the burden on proof in heterosexual relationship is lower, much lower than that. And I think we need to get some equity in that. The archival and interview materials are subjective and allow us only initially to see the centrality of other issues to women's movements. The fact that lesbians are women also makes them invisible, as I said. The women in this study are far from ordinary, and it is through their involvement in radical politics that they come to our attention. As historian Fergal McCarry has written in his article on Helena Maroney, well-founded or not, speculation highlights the relationship between gender, sexuality and power in post-revolutionary Ireland, and the troubling status of independent, unmarried females in a society that valued women as mothers rather than as citizens. Marginalised by class, religion, gender and nationalism, awkward women, and I do like awkward women, were long excluded from the narratives of the independence struggle, and I would further say long excluded from all narratives. I would argue that their private lives, integral as they are to the motivations of their public actions, have also been excluded. Here, my research has uncovered a number of these relationships and suggests to you that we have, in this revolutionary period, a rich existing history of same-sex relationships among political and radicalized women. It would be much harder to find relationships among women who are not political or in the history books or have archives, but that doesn't make it less worth our while. And indeed, when we look for it, the history already exists in archives and public documents, in material culture and artifacts. But since has put it so memorially, the possibilities of the not said and the not seen as conceptual tools for writing history. She notes lesbian history is a powerful example of history written for compelling moral reasons. And quoting Barbara Smith, we research and wrote so each of us would not know only better how to live, but how to dream. We believe profoundly that ideas matter, that history could change lives because it changed ours. Faced with a fierce backlash against homosexual life, this history has become more necessary today. The absence of lesbian histories and concerns from our narratives is a powerful way of ensuring that women, particularly lesbian women, queer women, continue to be deprived of a rich and satisfying history. And this can be part of an exclusion and marginalization generally of LGBT people in society. My research and that of others goes some ways to provide a corrective to that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mary, for that brilliant talk and for shedding some light on those hidden silent histories, as you called them. Really, really important work. Thank you. And now is your chance, everybody, to ask Mary some questions. So you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom. And thank you for your patience with the slight sound glitches we had during the talk. As I said at the start, for those of you who arrived afterwards, the talk's being recorded. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to watch back. We have a few questions in already. So the first one is from an anonymous member of the audience. When can we expect to see those extracts from Kathleen Lynn's diary?
The question. Well, since we've only just started on the research, it will be a good 2 years at the very least. So it's 20, I would say sometime in 2023. I sometimes forget what century I'm in. So 2023. Kathleen, there are 900,000 words in the diaries of Kathleen Lynn. Obviously, we can't publish all that. So we have to go through it and select, make a selection, and how we're going to do that will be interesting. What is interesting and what is not. But it's a very, it just shows how interesting women's diaries are for both the political and the personal. Kathleen Lynn's diary shows the relationship with Madeleine Mullen, but also shows how involved these women were, not just these two women, but so many of these radical women were in social, cultural, political, medical, politics, history, life in Ireland from the 20s, 30s, 40s, that they are so important. And it's so valuable to have diaries like Lynn's. And we don't have that many diaries because, again, people don't see women's diaries and women's archives as important. So having these is very important, having these women's archives, women's diaries, not just for lesbian women, but for all women, to write them back into the histories. It's vital that we have archives. A few of the working class women that I have some suspicion that were involved in same-sex relationship, I may never be able to prove it because their archives are sparse if they exist at all, but I'll certainly go deep diving and see what I can find.
Thank you. Another question from Lorraine. Hello, I'm curious about the definition of lesbian in Dr. McAuliffe's work, if it is inclusive of queer or bisexual women and used for brevity, or if it's just used when there's no evidence of romantic or sexual relationships with men. Thank you.
This is what I have to decide on when I'll be writing up the research within the next couple of weeks or months, and using the terms, because the women don't refer to themselves in those terms. And indeed, those terms aren't generally used by the broader public or by anyone outside maybe of the sexologists in the early 20th century. So do we call them lifelong comrades? Do we call them same-sex couples? I was using it for shorthand in this talk, really, but I will be more nuanced and more complicating the language way more when I am writing it up. Helena Maloney, for example, I would talk about more being bisexual. There is strong evidence that she was involved romantically, at least with Sean Connolly before his death in 1916. I'm not so sure about Bulmer Hobson. That is an unproven suggestion that she was involved in. And then there's no other relationships that seem to be in her life until she meets Dr. Evelyn O'Brien. So was she bi? Was she not? These are issues I'm going to have to deal with within the broader research project, that an article that I'll be writing. So again, I'll have to develop a more nuanced take on the language as I work on the research. But sometimes, yes, I use it as shorthand. Thank you.
A couple of similar questions here about sources. Firstly, Eileen asks, could you give us a reference again to the biography of Eva Gore Booth? Because she'd like to get a bit more information on Esther Roper. And Maddie says, I've tried to find extracts of the Urania journal, but had little luck. Could you maybe point me in the right direction?
Sonia Tiernan's work for both those. Sonia has published on Eva Gore Booth, the biography of Eva Gore Booth, and she's also written on the on Urania, and her references will lead you to where you can find Urania, but she would have large extracts from Urania in her articles on the publication, and in the biography of Eva as well. She talks, I think there's a whole chapter devoted to Urania.
Thank you. Grania says, thank you for the very informative talk, Mary. Do you have any thoughts or knowledge of Dr. Kathleen Lynn's family taking the decision to bury her in another graveyard to that where Madeleine French Mullen is buried? Thank you.
The impression I get from reading through the diaries of Lynn, and obviously with 900,000 words, we haven't done a deep dive into them as yet, is that the couple were much closer to the French Mullen family and visit with and go on holidays with them much more, and that Kathleen's family are kept more at a distance. Now, she does keep in touch with them and go on holidays with them, but there does seem to be a certain detached relationship, and certainly Madeleine doesn't seem to be involved in Kathleen's relationship with her own family. So yes, of course, Madeleine dies before Kathleen, and she's buried in Mount Jerome, I think. And Kathleen then is buried in she's buried in Glasnevin, and Kathleen is buried in Mount Jerome. So I am surprised that they were buried separately, but I haven't come across any detail on the burial itself, other than the hint that there was some disagreements between the family, yeah. But if anything comes up, that'll certainly make it into the detail of the article as well.
Thank you. And the last one we have for the minutes, very good talk, Mary, very interesting. Of those couples that were public, was there much comment from their peers? Thank you.
Interestingly, yes, in ways. I mean, again, you have to be mind down into the language that is used. Obviously, Rosamund Jacob talks about them, Madeleine and Kathleen. Hannah-She Skeffington is very good friends with Margaret Skinnider and Nora O'Keeffe, and the letters between them are between a couple and their friend. And Kathleen responds to Nora, who writes to her, or to Margaret, who writes to her. The letters are indicative of that relationship. And indeed, Nora Connolly O'Brien, this is how complicated it got when I was looking in the records for Margaret Skinnider and Nora O'Keeffe. They were catalogued under letters from Nora. And the only way I was able to tell the difference, because their handwriting was the same, is Nora O'Keeffe signed her name N-O for the R-A, and Nora Connolly was N-O-R-A. Nora Connolly writes to Hannah-She Skeffington about her friends, Margaret and Nora, again, as a couple. And so while there isn't, direct language, all the time you can see these people being written of as a couple. As I said, there are love letters from Judy Witters to Margot Trench in the National Library. We have an FBI document that talks about the relationship between Kathleen O'Brennan and Marie Equi. And Marie, anyway, was always a very out lesbian at a time when people weren't out. Esther Roper and Eva Gore Booth lived together all of their lives, are related. Their relationship with Constant is as a couple. Constance Markovich being Esther Roper or Eva Gore Booth's sister. And indeed, there seems to be a milieu of people of women in Dublin who form a network who are accepting of each other's relationships. And they don't use the language of contemporary LGBT culture, but there's certainly hints, and more than hints, of their acceptance of each other, of couples as couples. And they certainly treat each other and talk to each other as couples.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more if anyone wants to get a quick one in there. I suppose what a lot of us might be wondering is, where can we find out more, particularly now while we're waiting for the libraries to open? You mentioned the Trench Papers and National Library and the Hannay Skeffington Archive. Where would you recommend we go to learn more?
Well, they're there, and the Kathleen Lynn diaries are in the Royal College of Physicians, if anyone wants to plough through all 900,000 words. And they're very interesting for all sorts of reasons, not just the relationship with Madeleine French Mullen. The Irish newspapers are very interesting. I find going through the obituaries of these women, who's mentioned and who's not mentioned, very interesting as well. What I'm because these women that I've talked about this evening, there is evidence for their relationships with other women. What I'm most interested in then is trying to find out the detail of relationships of other women who don't leave such voluminous archives. There are so many of the radical women, the commemorated women, the socialist women, the feminist women who don't marry now. The vast majority of them are probably heterosexual women who just didn't marry. But there have to be some, again, who were in relationships with each other. And I've come across a couple of couples who shared homes together, ran businesses together, were together all of their lives. But the only evidence I have is they are in the same space together. And that's it. There are no letters, there are no diaries, there's no anything else. But it's funny how you find things. When I was writing Margaret Skinnider's biography, I was doing a little background research on her family and where her family came from in Ireland. And they came from outside of Monaghan in an estate owned by a woman whose name escapes me now, and I can't remember it. But when I was just looking up her, like how she treated her tenants and how the Skinnider family might have gotten on in that estate. And there was a document or an article in the local history journal about her. And it turns out she had a female companion whom she's buried with. And all the evidence seems to point that they were a same-sex couple as well. So I want to go back and look at them. Like, they're totally unconnected with my revolutionary lesbians or revolutionary women, just two women who were living together on an estate in Monaghan in the 19th century. Wouldn't it be wonderful if one of them left a diary somewhere, something like the Anne Lister diaries? And then there are just other hints that you pick up as you're going along about other women, other couples and relationships. But because I'm concentrating just on these revolutionary women, it is the ones that leave the archives that come to your attention and that you can find material evidence on.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Elizabeth asks, was this network of politically active and queer women in Ireland, the US and England replicated in other places or movements?
Yes, there are several books on the British suffragettes. There's a book that actually is called Suffragettes and Saphists. You see the same in America. I've just finished reading a biography of Mary McAuliffe, and she's interconnected with all sorts of different radical political groups in America, from the trade unions to the suffrage women, to cultural groups, to the Irish Republican women, some of whom the women are having relationships with each other, some of whom they're just political comrades. So yes, and of course I'm only looking at the Anglophone world because, that's where the Irish women are interconnected. So in all these first wave feminists and suffrage and socialist cohorts, you do find evidence of same-sex relationships between the women. And that's a very exciting history to be uncovering. Of course, it probably is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of and I love the word Sapphic, in terms of Sapphic histories, because again, as I said, outside of that cohort for whom we have material evidence, archival evidence or newspaper evidence, there must be a whole load of other women we have no evidence for and will never know about. And that history will unfortunately continue to remain hidden. But it's there in Ireland, in America, in Britain, I presume, in other parts of the world as well, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And some final comments to just wrap up on. Marie says, amazing talk. Thank you, Mary. The women of 1916 onwards were so written out of history, so it's great to hear your presentation. Thank you. It's been fascinating. And Rachel says, thank you for such an interesting talk. It's heartwarming to flesh out this history and that a gang may have supported each other to live freely at that time.
Yes. Yes, to Eileen. Yes, I think it was the Cahir record.
Thank you.
The woman's name was George. Oh, just gone. Sorry. It's lockdown brain.
I think we all have it.
Come back to me at some time tonight.
Well, all that remains is just to say thank you once again so much, Mary. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. Really looking forward to watching back as well once we have the recording prepared. And thank you all so much for coming along this evening. There are plenty of other talks coming up, so take a look on the website and sign up to the newsletter if you haven't already. That's always the best place to go to be the first to know. So hopefully we'll see you again in the future, and hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.